The spring snowmelt had turned Mud Creek into a raging brown torrent that carved through the Platte Valley spring 1867 Nebraska on the eve of statehood, like an angry scar. Satan Running Bear steadied his bay mare on the eastern bank, his weathered hands marked by 3 years of railroad conflicts gripping the reins as memories of violence surfaced unbidden. The puckered scar along his ribs pulled tight beneath his beaded shirt, a reminder of the day Union Pacific Guards had opened fire on his scouting party for getting too close to their precious steel rails. At 30, he'd learned to read danger in the cant of men's shoulders and the tension in their gun hands and the way they positioned themselves for violence. Those hard-won instincts now screamed warnings as he studied the scene across the swollen creek. A settler wagon lay overturned, like a wounded buffalo, its broken wheel jutting skyward, while panicked oxen bellowed against tangled traces. But what made his jaw clench wasn't the wrecked conveyance. It was the young woman pressed against the wagon's splintered side, one hand clutching her swollen belly, with the desperate grip of someone protecting more than just herself. 3 mounted men had their rifles trained on her, and even at this distance, Satan could see the predatory patience in their postures. These weren't road agents looking for quick coin. Their horses were too well fed, their gear too clean, their movements too coordinated. Professional men who took orders and asked no questions about what happened to the people they collected. "Mrs. Hayes?" The lead rider called out, his voice carrying false courtesy across the water. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Come along peaceful-like." The woman, perhaps 24, with auburn hair escaping from a torn calico bonnet, pressed herself tighter against the wagon. Despite her obvious terror, she held herself with the rigid spine of someone who'd learned that surrender often meant worse than fighting. "I told you once already." She called back, her voice trembling but resolute. "I ain't going nowhere with you men. My business is in gold dust, not back to that place." Satan's mare shifted restlessly beneath him, sensing his tension. The woman's words stirred something in his chest, recognition of the particular brand of desperate courage he'd heard in his own voice when railroad men had cornered him in a box canyon near Cheyenne. The resolve of someone who'd rather die fighting than live as property. The lead rider dismounted with theatrical patience, and Satan caught the glint of a tarnished deputy's star pinned to his leather vest. False law, then, which made the situation even more dangerous. Men who hid behind corrupted badges felt entitled to take liberties that even outlaws might hesitate to claim. "Now see here, Mrs. Here. Hayes." The bribed deputy continued, his tone sharpening with impatience. "You're carrying valuable property that rightfully belongs to our employer. That child in your belly, he's got a daddy with legal claims, and you've got debts that need settling." The woman's free hand moved instinctively to her swollen abdomen, and Satan saw her entire body go rigid with a fury that burned hotter than fear. "This baby belongs to nobody but itself and me," she declared, her voice ringing across the water. "And I'll die before I let Leopold Kessler lay claim to either of us." The name hit Satan like a physical blow. Every man in the territory had heard of Leopold Kessler, ranch baron, mine owner, and political power broker who commanded respect through wealth and carefully applied violence. He was the kind of man who treated law as a suggestion that applied to other people. "That can be arranged?" The bribed deputy replied, his hand moving to rest on his gun butt. But it'd be a waste of good breeding stock. The casual cruelty of those words decided matters for Satan. His Winchester rifle, a model 1866, with brass receiver that had served him well in conflicts with railroad guards, came up smooth and practiced as he guided his mare down the muddy bank toward the ford. The current ran deep and fast, from mountain snowmelt cold enough to steal breath and strong enough to sweep away anything that lost its footing. But his mare was Wyoming-bred and sure-footed, picking her way across the treacherous bottom with careful precision. "Rider coming in," one of the gunmen called out, noting the beadwork on Sitan's shirt and the eagle feather braided into his black hair. "Looks like a redskin." The bribed deputy turned his attention to Sitan with automatic disdain. "This ain't your concern, blanket ass. Best keep riding before you end up buzzard bait." Sitan positioned his horse between the gunmen, and the woman his Winchester held ready, but not quite aimed. "Creek runs high," he said in careful English, his accent marking him as someone who'd learned the white man's tongue as necessity rather than birth. "Woman cannot cross alone." It was a reasonable excuse that might let all parties save face. But Sitan could see in the hired gun's eyes that they'd already passed the point where reason mattered. Their employer wanted this woman badly enough to send 3 armed men after her in broad daylight. The woman was staring at him with eyes the color of winter sky, her breathing shallow and quick, with what he now recognized as the beginning of labor pains. The stress and fear were bringing on early contractions. "Mister," she called out to him, her voice tight with controlled panic. "I'm obliged for your concern. But these men mean to drag me back to a man who ain't got any right to claim me or my child." "Every man's got rights to his own blood," the bribed deputy snapped. "Especially when that blood's carried by a woman who owes him for her upkeep and protection." Sitan had heard enough. The pieces were falling into place: a powerful man who considered women and children his property, corrupt lawmen willing to enforce his claims, and a young mother caught in the middle with nowhere to run. His Winchester swung up to cover the bribed deputy, who was already reaching for his sidearm with the confidence of a man who'd never faced anyone who could shoot back. The rifle cracked once sharp as thunder, and the deputy spun like a child's top before crashing face first into the mud. The other 2 riders wheeled their horses, firing wild shots that went wide. Sitan worked the Winchester's lever with practiced smoothness, ejecting spent brass and chambering fresh rounds. His second shot clipped the nearest rider's hat, along with a good portion of his ear. "Next one goes center mass." Sitan called out, his voice carrying quiet certainty. The surviving gunmen exchanged glances, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. "This ain't finished," one shouted as they spurred toward the cottonwood breaks. "We'll be back with more men." They disappeared into timber, leaving only hoofbeats and threats hanging in the air. Sitan kept his rifle ready until sounds faded completely, then swung down from his horse and waded through knee-deep water to where the woman waited. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, with practical beauty that came from good bones and honest work rather than powder and paint. Her dress was calico dyed indigo blue with tiny pearl buttons and careful mending that spoke of pride despite limited means. "You hurt?" he asked, noting how she favored her left side. She shook her head, though her face was pale as morning frost. "Not hurt exactly. But the baby?" She winced as another contraction gripped her. "It's coming early. The upset maybe, or when they forced me off the trail." Sitan looked at the dead man in the mud, then back toward trees where the others had vanished. They'd return with reinforcements, and next time they'd bring more guns and less patience. "Can you ride?" "Reckon I'll have to," she replied, straightening with visible effort. "Can't stay here." Without another word, Sitan lifted her onto his mare's back, settling her sideways across the saddle. She was lighter than expected, all determination and grit, with not much flesh to spare. "I'm Nora," she said through gritted teeth as he swung up behind her. "Nora Hayes, and I'm mighty grateful for what you done." "Sitan Running Bear," he replied, taking the reins. "Talk later, move now." They forded the swollen creek in tense silence, the mare struggling against current, while Nora gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles. Behind them, threats echoed like distant thunder, a promise of storms to come. As they climbed the far bank and disappeared into willow brakes, following game trails invisible to untrained eyes, Seaton found himself thinking about the way Nora had refused to surrender, even with 3 guns pointed at her belly. That kind of courage was rare, and it usually came from having something worth dying for. The mare's hooves found solid ground as they left the creek bottom, following paths that would confuse pursuit. But Seaton knew this country like his own heartbeat, every draw and ridge, every water source and hiding place. They would need that knowledge in days ahead, because men with money and false badges weren't easily discouraged. As they rode deeper into rough country with Nora leaning back against his chest for support and the baby stirring restlessly in her womb, Seaton understood that his life had just taken a turn toward complications he couldn't foresee. But sometimes a man had to choose between the safe path and the right path. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The cabin perched on a timbered rise overlooking the scattered buildings of sagebrush, like a hawk watching for prey. Built from hand-hewn gray pine logs and chinked with red clay, it spoke of a man who understood both carpentry and survival. Smoke drifted from the stone chimney, and a small corral held feed and water for the mare that had carried them to safety. Seaton helped Nora down from the horse, noting how she pressed one hand to her lower back and breathed in, careful, measured rhythm. The contractions were still irregular, but growing stronger. "Rest here," he said, guiding her to a split log bench beside the door. "I tend horse, then see to your needs." The cabin's interior reflected its owner's dual heritage and hard-won experience. Lakota beadwork in geometric patterns of red and blue hung beside a Winchester rifle and a cavalry saber taken from a dead soldier. A buffalo robe covered rough plank floors near the stone hearth, while a traditional cradleboard hung from a wooden peg. Nora's gaze lingered on the cradleboard, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly's curve. "How much longer, you reckon?" Seaton followed her look to the woven willow basket. "Babies come when they choose, but yours seems eager to meet the world." While he rubbed down the mare and checked her hooves for stones, Seaton found himself studying his unexpected guest through the open door. Despite obvious fear and discomfort, she watched everything with intelligent assessment, the cabin's defensible position, weapon placement, distance to cover if they needed to run. She was thinking like a survivor, not a victim. "Those men back at the creek," she said as he built up the fire and hung a pot of water over flames. "They work for Leopold Kessler." Every man in the territory knew that name: ranch baron, mine owner, political power broker, who commanded respect through wealth and violence. He treated law as suggestions that applied to other people. "Big man." Seaton observed mixing cornmeal with water and wild honey. "Rich man. Why he send guns after you?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, fingers worrying the thin gold band on her left hand. When she spoke, her voice carried careful weight. "I worked in his house for a time before I married Thomas. Cleaning, cooking, honest work for honest wages." She paused, jaw tightening. "Mr. Kessler got ideas about what else my employment might include. When I made clear those ideas weren't welcome, he found ways to make my life difficult." The careful phrasing told Seaton more than detailed explanation would have. Men with power thought they owned whatever caught their fancy land, livestock, or women. "Your husband protected you." Thomas was a good man. Simple farmer who didn't have much, but what he had, he shared freely. Her voice softened with genuine affection. "When I told him about my situation, he married me quick to give me his name and protection." "But Kessler's men found you." "They came right after the funeral. Had papers saying Thomas owed money, doctor bills, supplies, things we never bought or borrowed. Said the debt passed to me, and the only way to work it off was to return to his household." False debts used to enslave those too weak to fight back in court. But there was something more personal here, something that explained the lengths Kessler would go to reclaim one pregnant woman. A sharp knock interrupted them, but the voice that called out was familiar and welcome. "Seton, it's Doc Emmett. Saw your smoke from town." Dr. Emmett Barnes was one of the few white men who treated local Lakota with genuine respect. A soft-spoken man in his 40s who'd come west from Ohio to escape his own demons, he'd earned his place by doctoring anyone who needed it, regardless of ability to pay or skin color. Seton opened the door to find the physician with his black medical bag and a small bottle of laudanum. Behind wire-rimmed spectacles, gray eyes took in the situation immediately. "Heard there was trouble at Mud Creek," Emmett said quietly. "3 riders came through asking questions about a Lakota scout and pregnant woman. They didn't seem friendly." "One won't be asking questions no more," Seton replied. "The others promised to return with help." Emmett nodded gravely and approached Nora with careful manner. "Mrs. Hayes, I presume, may I examine you, just to ensure you and the baby are well after your ordeal?" Nora glanced at Seton, who nodded encouragingly. The doctor's hands were gentle but thorough, checking pulse and listening to the baby's heartbeat. He noted fresh rope burns on her wrists and a fading bruise on her jaw. "The baby's fine," he announced. "Strong heartbeat, good position. The contractions are false labor brought on by stress. You should have several more weeks." Relief flooded Nora's face. "Those men said they'd be back." "I'm afraid they're probably right," Emmett replied grimly. "But you're not friendless here. There are folks in town who won't stand for this kind of harassment." As the doctor prepared to leave, he paused thoughtfully. "Mrs. Hayes, might I ask, when exactly is this child due?" "Late summer, I reckon. August or September." Emmett's brow furrowed slightly. "And when did you marry Thomas?" "Last October, right after harvest." The doctor nodded slowly, making mental calculations that seemed to satisfy him. "Good. That timing might prove important if questions arise about the child's legitimacy." After Emmett departed, promising to return with supplies, Seton and Nora settled into careful routine of people learning to share space and danger. She helped tend the fire while he cleaned weapons and counted ammunition. "Why did you help me?" Nora asked as they prepared sleeping arrangements. Seton considered the question while checking loads in his Colt Navy cap-and-ball service-worn but reliable revolver. Creek was running high. You could not cross alone. But they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. Something in her refusal to surrender had spoken to him that kind of courage deserved respect, regardless of circumstances. "Those men knew things about my situation," Nora said quietly, staring into dying flames. "Called the baby valuable property like they knew details I never told nobody except Thomas. Kessler has long reach, long memory too." Nora was silent for a long moment, then spoke words that dropped into silence like stones into still water. "He claims the baby is his." The admission explained everything: the desperation of pursuit, the personal nature of threats, why a woman would choose running over, fighting through legal channels. "But it ain't true," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Thomas and I, we were together as man and wife from our wedding night. This child is his, conceived in love and legitimacy. Kessler's lying to justify his claims, trying to steal away the only thing left of the good man I married." "He will not touch you again," Seton said simply. It was a promise he had no business making considering the odds. But some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. Outside wind picked up rattling oiled paper windows and carrying scent of coming weather. They had shelter and food and the beginning of trust. More importantly, they had time to plan. As they settled into sleep, Nora in the bed, Satan on his buffalo robe with Winchester close, she spoke once more into darkness. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for helping me protect what's left of Thomas." Satan listened to her breathing gradually slow, carrying weight of that knowledge into sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were safe. In a world where those blessings couldn't be taken for granted, it was enough. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows, as Satan settled into the light sleep of a man alert for danger. His rifle lay loaded and ready, because frontier life had taught him that safety was always temporary. But for now, in their small circle of warmth and light, two unlikely allies gathered strength for whatever tomorrow might bring. Dawn came gray and bitter cold with frost silvering meadow grass and the promise of another late spring storm building on the northern horizon. Satan woke to the sound of multiple horses approaching from town. Not the urgent gallop of immediate violence, but the steady pace of official business. He was on his feet with Winchester in hand before fully awake, but a glance through the window showed Sheriff. He added, "Judge Patterson rides in from the territorial capital tomorrow. The U.S. Attorney has been telegraphed. Conrad leading a small group up the trail." Behind him rode two deputies, both men Satan recognized as reasonably honest despite their profession. Nora stirred on the bed, her hand instinctively moving to her belly, where the baby had been restless all night. "Trouble?" "Maybe," Satan replied. Noting Conrad rode openly with hands visible rather than approaching with stealth. "But careful still." Sheriff Conrad was a man caught between competing pressures, honest enough to recognize injustice, but practical enough to understand limits of his authority. At 42, his hair was prematurely gray from the stress of keeping peace, where powerful men made their own law. "Satan, Mrs. Hayes," Conrad called out formally as he dismounted. "I need to speak with both of you about yesterday's incident at Mud Creek." It was a polite way of saying they were in serious trouble, but at least he'd come to talk rather than arriving with drawn guns. That suggested room for negotiation. "The man I killed drew first," Satan said without preamble. "I believe that," Conrad replied. "Jake Morrison was known for hiring his gun to anyone with coin. Problem is, Leopold Kessler's filed complaints claiming you murdered his employee and stole a horse worth $200. Even if they could prove the shooting was self-defense, the horse theft charge would justify arrest and give Kessler legal grounds to claim custody of Nora. The horse belonged to the man who tried to kill us," Nora protested. "Can you prove that? Because Kessler's got a bill of sale showing he purchased the animal last week from a dealer in Blackwater Falls." Another forgery, almost certainly, but one difficult to disprove. Kessler was covering all bases, creating a web of false documentation to entangle enemies in legal proceedings. "There's more," Conrad continued reluctantly. "Kessler's filed additional papers claiming Mrs. Hayes owes substantial debt to his estate, inherited from her late husband. Says you're harboring stolen property, meaning her and the unborn child." "Those debts are lies," Nora said firmly. "Thomas never borrowed a cent from Leopold Kessler." "I believe you," Conrad said quietly. "But believing and proving are different things in court. Kessler's got documentation, witnesses, all the legal trappings judges like to see." One of the deputies cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, there's something else. Judge Patterson's riding down from the territorial capital to hear this case personal-like. Should be here by tomorrow afternoon." That was the worst news yet. Judge Patterson was known for strict interpretation of property law, and his belief that maintaining order required supporting established authority men like Kessler, who brought stability and investment to frontier communities. "How long do we have?" Sitan asked. "Court set for day after tomorrow. That gives you about 36 hours to prepare a defense." Running would make them fugitives, but staying meant confronting one of the territory's most powerful men with nothing but their word against his documentation. After the lawmen departed, Sitan and Nora faced reality of their situation. They had a day and a half to find evidence that would expose Kessler's criminal activities or convince a territorial judge that their word held value. "There might be a way," Nora said slowly, staring thoughtfully at the cold fireplace. "Something I remembered while the sheriff was talking. When I worked in Kessler's house, I sometimes cleaned his office. There was a safe behind a painting of his late wife, and I saw him put papers there that he said were too important to trust to banks." "What kind of papers?" "Don't rightly know, but some had official seals. Territory business maybe, or mining claims. The kind that might tell a different story than what he shows in public." It was thin hope, but better than no hope. The problem was getting close enough to Kessler's ranch house to search his private office without being caught. "Too dangerous," Sitan said immediately. "If his men caught you, they won't expect me to walk right into their territory. A pregnant woman looking for work wouldn't seem suspicious." She had a point, but the risk was enormous. If identified, she'd be trapped with no escape. Their discussion was interrupted by arrival of unexpected allies. Hattie Morrison, the local schoolteacher, approached, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. Behind her walked Godfrey Walsh, a weathered farmer, whose own struggles with corrupt officials had taught him to recognize injustice. Hattie was a spinster in her mid-30s, iron-gray hair pulled back severely, but kind eyes behind wire spectacles. She'd come west to teach after losing her fiancé in the war between the states. "Brought you some necessities," she announced, unpacking coffee-dried beans and soft cloth suitable for baby clothes. "Word's getting around town about your situation. Folks are choosing sides." Godfrey nodded grimly, setting down flour and rifle cartridges without being asked. At 50, he'd learned to read signs of brewing trouble. "Most working folks are with you," he reported. "Shopkeepers, farmers, anyone who's felt the squeeze of a powerful man's influence. But Kessler's got business owners scared." "What about Sheriff Conrad?" Nora asked. "Honest man in a bad position," Hattie replied diplomatically. "He'll enforce the law as he sees it, but he's not above bending it if the cause is just and evidence is solid." That carried particular weight. Conrad might overlook certain irregularities in how evidence was obtained, provided it was genuine. "There's something else," Godfrey added quietly. "Been hearing rumors about Kessler's mining operation up in Copper Canyon. Men working double shifts without proper pay accidents that don't get reported. If someone could get evidence of that. Evidence of criminal activity might give them leverage, something to trade for Nora's freedom." As visitors prepared to leave, Hattie paused at the door. "There's a ladies' sewing circle meeting tomorrow evening at the church. Mrs. Hayes, you'd be welcome if you felt up to it. Sometimes the best information comes from women talking while their hands are busy." It was coded message the sewing circle would provide cover for gathering intelligence and coordinating support. After they departed, Satan and Nora spent the rest of the day preparing for what might be their only chance to turn tables before Judge Patterson arrived. The plan they devised was desperate and dangerous, but it offered possibility of exposing truth about Leopold Kessler's criminal empire. That evening, sharing a simple meal of cornbread and venison stew, Nora broke the careful silence they'd maintained while planning. "When this is over," she said quietly, "assuming we both survive it, what then?" It was a question that went beyond immediate survival to touch deeper uncertainties. They'd been thrown together by violence and necessity, but what would hold them together when immediate crisis passed? "We see what comes," Sitan replied, stirring honey into his coffee. "Make choices as they present themselves." It wasn't romantic declaration, but it was honest acknowledgement that their partnership had grown beyond simple alliance into something more complex and potentially lasting. Outside, wind picked up and began driving sleet against windows. The storm they'd seen building all day was finally arriving, and it would provide perfect cover for a dangerous work they planned to attempt under darkness. As they prepared for what might be their final gamble, both understood that the next 12 hours would determine not just their immediate fate, but the future of the child Nora carried. They were fighting for more than freedom. They were fighting for the right to exist on their own terms. The lamp burned late as they went over the plans one final time, memorizing details while storm raged outside. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or disaster, but they would face it together, bound by choices that had transformed strangers into something approaching family. The sleet had turned to heavy snow by midnight, creating perfect conditions for work that required darkness and silence. Satan blackened his face with charcoal and wrapped his rifle in oiled cloth, while Nora prepared for her own dangerous role in their desperate gambit. "Remember," he said as they made final preparations, "if anything goes wrong, you run for the church. Hattie will protect you." Nora nodded, though they both knew that if their plan failed, there might not be anywhere safe from Leopold Kessler's reach. She'd changed into her oldest dress, faded brown wool that wouldn't show dirt or blood, and braided her hair severely back. She looked like what she was pretending to be, a desperate woman seeking work to support herself and her unborn child. They parted ways at Town's Edge, Seaton, heading north toward rough country where Kessler's mining operation scarred the landscape, while Nora approached the rancher's mansion from the south. Snow-muffled sound and limited visibility giving them both needed cover. Kessler's house sat on a hill overlooking the Platte River Valley, like a feudal castle surveying its domain. Built from imported brick, with gingerbread trim that spoke of Eastern pretensions, it was ostentatious display that powerful men used to remind neighbors of the gap between wealth and poverty. Nora approached the servants' entrance with submissive posture of someone who'd learned not to challenge authority directly. When the housekeeper, a stern-faced German woman named Mrs. Brennan, answered her knock, she was ready with carefully rehearsed story. "Please, ma'am," she said, affecting a thick Irish accent she'd heard from railroad workers. "I'm looking for any kind of work. Cleaning, cooking, mending, anything honest to help me get by until my baby comes." Mrs. Brennan looked her over, with calculating eye of someone who'd hired dozens of desperate women. "You got references? Someone who can vouch for your character?" "No, ma'am. My husband died this winter and I've been traveling ever since. Just need a chance to prove I'm willing to work hard." The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. "Kitchen could use extra hands. Cook's been complaining about workload with all the extra men Mr. Kessler's been hiring lately. But it's only temporary work and pay ain't much. Anything's better than nothing. Thank you kindly." She was put to work immediately, scrubbing pots and peeling vegetables, while regular kitchen staff prepared late supper for Kessler's men. The work was familiar and soothing, giving her hands something to do while her mind cataloged everything she observed. The house buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Armed men came and went through the back entrance, reporting to someone in Kessler's office about patrols and security arrangements. She caught fragments of conversation suggesting a major operation being planned for the following day, something that would settle the problem permanently. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in Copper Canyon, Seaton was discovering that Kessler's mining operation was far worse than anyone suspected. What he'd found wasn't just poor working conditions, it was systematic enslavement disguised as legal labor contracts. The mine workings were a testament to human suffering. Tunnels had been driven deep into mountainside with minimal timber support, creating conditions that would have been condemned by any legitimate inspector. Men worked by oil lamp light in spaces barely wide enough for their bodies breathing air thick with rock dust and poisonous gases. But it was the workers' quarters that revealed the true nature of the operation. Men slept chained to their bunks, wore leg irons that prevented free movement, and bore scars of regular beatings. Most appeared to be immigrants, Chinese, Irish, German, who'd been lured west with promises of honest work, only to find themselves trapped in conditions that differed from slavery only in name. Satan crept closer to the main office, a ramshackle building where armed guards kept watch over ledgers and correspondence. Through grimy window, he could see records documenting the buying and selling of human beings like livestock. Names, ages, physical descriptions, purchase prices filled page after page of careful accounting. The foreman on duty was Iron Hand Morgan, a scarred brute whose reputation for cruelty was known throughout the territory. He sat at a desk counting money, while 3 guards played cards and drank rotgut whiskey. Boss wants the troublemakers dealt with permanent like Iron Hand was saying. No more accidents, just bullets and shallow graves where nobody'll find 'em. It was exactly the evidence they needed, but getting it would require enormous risks. The office was heavily guarded, and any attempt to copy ledgers would almost certainly result in capture or death. Back at the mansion, Nora had worked her way closer to Kessler's private office through diligence and apparent invisibility. Servants who did their jobs quietly became part of the furniture noticed only when they failed to perform duties. She'd learned that Kessler was expected to return from a business trip before dawn, and that his office would need cleaning before his arrival. It was the opportunity she'd hoped for, legitimate reason to be alone in the room where he kept sensitive documents. The office was a shrine to masculine power and territorial ambition. Maps covered walls showing mining claims, railroad routes, political boundaries. A gun case held impressive weapon collection, while shelves displayed books on law mining and territorial governance. But it was the safe behind the portrait of Kessler's late wife that drew Nora's attention. She'd seen him use it during previous employment, and she remembered his habit of speaking the combination aloud, a quirk she'd thought merely eccentric. The numbers came back as she knelt before the safe. His wife's birthday reversed and repeated. Tumblers clicked softly as she worked the combination, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain guards outside could hear it. Inside the safe, she found exactly what she'd hoped for. Documents revealing the full scope of Kessler's criminal activities. Mining contracts that enslaved workers' bribery records showing payments to judges, and territorial officials' correspondence detailing plans to eliminate threats to his operations. But the most damning evidence was a leather-bound journal written in Kessler's own hand. As she carefully turned pages, copying the most important information onto scraps of paper, a terrible truth emerged that made her hands shake with more than fear. The journal entries revealed Kessler's deepest secret, one that explained his obsession with claiming her child. Medical records from Eastern doctors' consultations about fertility treatments, desperate attempts to father an heir. The final entry, dated just months before her marriage to Thomas, was written in Kessler's distinctive hand. The doctors confirm what I have long suspected. The fever that nearly killed me in my youth has left me unable to father children. My line dies with me unless I can find another way. The Hayes woman carries what I can never produce, legitimate offspring to carry my name and inherit my empire. She must be made to understand that the child she bears belongs to me by right of need, if not by blood. The words hit Nora like physical blows. Kessler had known all along that the baby wasn't his. He'd fabricated the entire story about being the father to justify his claims. He was so desperate for an heir that he was willing to steal another man's child and destroy lives to get it. As she copied the damning passages, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Someone was approaching the office with measured pace of a man who owned everything he surveyed. Leopold Kessler had returned early from his business trip. Nora barely had time to close the safe and hide the copied documents in her dress before the office door swung open. Kessler entered with predatory grace of a man accustomed to commanding immediate attention and respect. At 45, he was still handsome in a cold aristocratic way that women found attractive until they learned what lay beneath the polished exterior. His pale blue eyes, distinctive with brown flecks that seemed to shift color in different light, swept the room with automatic suspicion before settling on Nora. But instead of discovering her immediately, Nora's desperation drove her to seek hiding. As the door handle turned, she slipped behind the heavy velvet drapes that framed the tall windows, pressing herself against the cold glass and trying to control her ragged breathing. Kessler entered and moved to his desk, apparently unaware of her presence. He lit an oil lamp and began sorting through papers, occasionally muttering to himself about territorial politics and mining quotas. Nora remained frozen behind the curtains, inches from discovery, as he worked mere feet away. Mrs. Brennan mentioned hiring a new girl tonight. Kessler said aloud, though, whether to himself or someone else, Nora couldn't tell. Irish, she said. Pregnant and desperate for work. Just the kind of woman who asks no questions and sees nothing that might concern her. He paused in his work, and Nora could hear him pouring whiskey from a crystal decanter. The sound of liquid hitting glass seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Of course, Kessler continued conversationally, sometimes desperate women try to be clever. They think they can take advantage of a man's charity, perhaps even steal from him. That would be unfortunate. The threat was clear, and Nora realized with growing horror that he suspected something. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed deeper into the curtain's folds, trying to become invisible. Kessler's footsteps approached the window where she hid. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see his boots stop just inches from her position. If he reached out to adjust the drapes. Instead, he turned away and walked to the safe. Nora heard the distinctive sound of the combination being worked, then the creak of the heavy door opening. After a moment of silence that stretched like eternity, Kessler spoke again. "Interesting," he said softly. "Someone has been reading my private papers. Someone who knew the combination to my safe and had access to my office." The game was up, but before Kessler could investigate further, the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of Copper Canyon. Shouts and screams followed along with the distinctive crack of Winchester rifles and boom of shotguns echoing off canyon walls. Kessler's head snapped toward the window, his face going pale with sudden understanding. Impossible. Conrad wouldn't dare. But the evidence of eyes and ears said otherwise. Sheriff Conrad and a large posse were attacking the mining operation with military precision, and the sounds of battle suggested they were meeting serious resistance. In the confusion of the moment, Nora saw her chance. While Kessler's attention was diverted by the disaster unfolding at his illegal operation, she slipped from behind the curtains and darted toward the door. But Kessler's reflexes were sharp, and his hand shot out to grab her wrist with crushing strength. Recognition dawned in his distinctive eyes as he took in her face. "Well, well," he said with cold satisfaction. "Mrs. Nora Hayes returning to the scene of her former employment. How thoughtful of you to save me the trouble of hunting you down." "Let me go," Nora said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "I think not. You see, my dear, you've been reading things that weren't meant for your eyes. That makes you dangerous, and I deal with dangerous people in permanent ways." But even as he spoke, more gunfire erupted from Copper Canyon, accompanied by what sounded like explosions. Orange light flickered against the office windows, suggesting fires had broken out at the mining operation. "Your empire is falling apart," Nora said, finding courage in his obvious distress. "Whatever you've built on the suffering of others is coming to an end." Kessler's grip tightened painfully on her wrist. "Perhaps. But I'll still have what I came for, you and the child you carry. My heir, whether conceived in my bed or another man's." "The baby isn't yours," Nora said firmly. "It never was, and you know it. I read your journal, Leopold. I know about your condition, your desperation, your plan to steal another man's child." For the first time, Kessler's composed mask slipped. Rage and desperation warred in his features as he realized his deepest secret had been exposed. "That changes nothing," he snarled. "I need an heir, and you're going to provide one. The child will grow up as my son, inherit my wealth and power, carry my name into the future. Over my dead body, if necessary," Kessler replied coldly. "Though I'd prefer to keep you alive long enough to raise the boy. After that," he shrugged eloquently. The struggle that followed was brief but vicious. Kessler had size and strength, but Nora had desperation and the knowledge that capture meant worse than death for both herself and her unborn child. She clawed at his face, leaving bloody furrows across his cheek, while he tried to subdue her without damaging what he considered his property. The fight ended when Mrs. Brennan burst through the door, drawn by sounds of struggle. The housekeeper took in the scene immediately, her employer attacking a pregnant servant, and her face hardened with moral outrage. "Mr. Kessler," she said firmly, "release that girl this instant." The interruption gave Nora the opening she needed. She broke free from Kessler's grip and ran for the door, clutching stolen documents against her chest like shield. Behind her, she could hear Kessler shouting orders to his men, but the attack on the mining operation had drawn most of his security away from the house. She ran through snow toward town, breath coming in sharp gasps as the baby shifted restlessly within her womb. The documents she carried would expose Kessler's crimes to the world, but only if she could reach Sheriff Conrad before his men hunted her down. The storm was getting worse, and footing was treacherous, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind her, she could hear horses and shouting as Kessler's remaining men organized pursuit. Everything depended on reaching safety before her enemies could silence her permanently. But the chase through storm-lashed countryside would test every ounce of strength and cunning she possessed. The snow was falling heavily now, obscuring landmarks and making each step an ordeal for someone in her condition. The stress and exertion were bringing on premature labor, just as they had during the confrontation at Mud Creek. She was crossing a frozen creek when ice gave way beneath her feet, plunging her into waters so cold it drove breath from her lungs. The shock of frigid immersion sent a powerful contraction through her body, strong enough to make her cry out, despite determination to remain silent. The sound carried clearly through winter air, and pursuit voices rose in triumph from somewhere behind her. "There, she's in the creek bottom. Cut her off before she reaches the bridge." Nora struggled out of icy water, her dress now heavy with freezing slush that made every step an ordeal. But the documents pressed against her chest remained dry, protected by her body heat and oiled cloth she'd wrapped them in. Ahead, barely visible through swirling snow, were the welcoming lights of Sagebrush's church steeple. She stumbled toward that beacon of hope, strength failing with every step, but resolve undiminished. The baby was coming, whether she wanted it to or not, and she needed to find safety before she was completely helpless. As she reached the church and collapsed just inside the threshold, Nora Hayes carried with her the evidence that would either destroy Leopold Kessler's criminal empire or seal her own doom. But the most dangerous moments still lay ahead, and everything depended on the courage of ordinary people willing to stand up to extraordinary evil. The attack on Copper Canyon had been building for weeks, ever since Sheriff Conrad received intelligence about conditions at Kessler's mining operation. What he and his deputies found when they infiltrated the compound under cover of darkness exceeded their worst expectations. Satan had provided crucial information about guard positions and shift changes, allowing lawmen to position themselves for maximum advantage before launching their assault. But even with the element of surprise, the battle was fierce and costly. The mining camp was a vision of hell carved into the mountainside. Slaves, for that's what they truly were despite legal fiction of labor contracts, lived in squalid barracks surrounded by armed guards. Most were immigrants who'd been lured west with promises of honest work, only to find themselves trapped in conditions that made death seem preferable to life. Iron Hand Morgan and his crew fought with desperation of men who knew capture meant hanging. They'd turned the mining office into a fortress, using overturned tables and ore carts as barricades while keeping their captive workers chained in tunnels as human shields. "Give it up, Morgan," Conrad shouted from behind a boulder that provided cover from defenders' rifles. "You're surrounded and there's no way out." The foreman's reply was a burst of gunfire that sent rock chips flying. "Come and take us, Sheriff, but you'll pay dear for every step." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Seton had worked his way around to the back of the office building while defenders' attention was focused on Conrad's men. Using knowledge of the terrain gained through careful reconnaissance, he positioned himself where he could see into the building through a rear window. What he witnessed made his blood run cold. Iron Hand was preparing to execute several chained prisoners rather than let them be freed to testify against Kessler's operation. The foreman had his gun drawn and was moving toward a group of terrified men who couldn't run or defend themselves. Setan's rifle cracked once through the window, the bullet taking Iron Hand's center mass and spinning him away from his intended victims. In the confusion that followed, Conrad's deputies rushed the building from 3 sides simultaneously. The remaining guards surrendered quickly once they realized their position was hopeless, though several died fighting rather than face territorial justice. When the smoke cleared, Conrad and his men had liberated more than 40 enslaved workers and captured evidence that would expose corruption reaching into every level of territorial government. "Sweet Jesus," Conrad breathed as he examined the records. "This goes all the way to the territorial capital. Judges, legislators, even the governor's office." But their victory at the mining camp was overshadowed by realization that Kessler himself was still free and undoubtedly planning his response to the raid. The rancher had too much to lose to accept defeat gracefully. Meanwhile, Nora's flight through the storm had become a race against time and elements. The church door was unlocked as frontier churches traditionally remained for travelers seeking shelter. She collapsed just inside the threshold, her body racked with contractions that were no longer false labor, but the real thing. Hattie Morrison found her there 20 minutes later, drawn by sounds of distress and the trail of melting snow that led from door to where Nora lay gasping on wooden floor. "Sweet mercy," Hattie breathed, taking in the situation immediately. "How long have you been in labor?" "Don't know," Nora managed between contractions. "Started when I fell in the creek. The baby's coming early and Kessler's men are right behind me." Hattie helped her to a pew and began organizing what they would need for emergency delivery. But before she could do more, the church door burst open to admit Jake Wilson and 2 of his men, their guns drawn and faces grim with determination. "Well, well," Wilson said with cold satisfaction. "End of the line, Mrs. Hayes. Time to come home where you belong." But Hattie Morrison stepped between the gunman and laboring woman with fearless courage of a schoolteacher who'd faced down bullies of all ages. "Get out," she said firmly. "This is God's house, and you'll not commit violence here." Wilson's laugh was harsh as winter wind. "God's house or not, lady, I got orders to bring this woman back. You can step aside voluntary-like, or I can move you myself. You'll have to kill me first. And I don't think you want to add murdering a schoolteacher to your list of crimes." The standoff might have continued, but the sound of approaching horses announced arrival of Sheriff Conrad and his deputies, fresh from their victory at the mining camp. The lawmen burst into the church with weapons ready, surrounding Wilson's men before they could react. "Drop your guns," Conrad ordered. "You're all under arrest." Wilson's hand twitched toward his holster, but the odds were hopeless. As the gunmen were disarmed and secured, Nora's labor intensified to the point where conversation became impossible. Dr. Emmett arrived just as the baby's head crowned his medical bag in hand, and face grim with knowledge of what they were all facing. The child was arriving weeks early, under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced physician. "Push, Mrs. Hayes," he said calmly. "Just a little more and we'll have this baby breathing free air." With a final tremendous effort that seemed to draw on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Nora brought her child into the world. The baby emerged in a rush of fluid and blood, tiny and red, but unmistakably alive. But as Dr. Emmett lifted the newborn to clear its airways, something remarkable became apparent. The baby's eyes, when they opened moments later, were not the pale blue with brown flecks that would have marked him as Leopold Kessler's son. Instead, they were the warm brown of his true father, Thomas Hayes. "He's beautiful," Hattie whispered, her voice filled with wonder despite the circumstances. "And he's free." That last word carried particular weight in context of everything that had happened. The child was free from false father's control, free from the criminal empire that had sought to claim him as property free to grow up and choose his own path in life. As Nora held her son for the first time, she felt a peace she hadn't known in months. This was Thomas's child, conceived in love and born in freedom. Kessler's lies had been exposed, his crimes revealed, his power broken. Outside, the storm was beginning to break, and first pale light of dawn was visible through the church's stained glass windows. The long night of danger and violence was finally ending. The documents Nora had risked her life to steal from Kessler's safe would provide evidence needed to dismantle his criminal organization and bring justice to its victims. But the man himself remained at large, and everyone knew that cornered predators were often at their most dangerous, as the baby nursed contentedly at his mother's breast. Sheriff Conrad organized his men to continue the search for Leopold Kessler. The territorial authorities were already on their way, drawn by telegraphed reports of the mining camp raid. But Kessler's final confrontation would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would test everything they'd fought for in the crucible of one last desperate gamble. Leopold Kessler's final gambit came at dawn, as storm clouds parted to reveal a landscape transformed by fresh snow. He arrived at the church leading a handful of hard-faced men, but instead of attempting direct assault, he chose a more insidious approach. "Sheriff Conrad," he called out from the churchyard, his voice carrying authority of a man accustomed to having orders obeyed. "I'm here under territorial warrant to collect stolen property and recover a kidnapped woman." It was masterful legal theater. Kessler produced documents bearing official seals claiming authority from the territorial capital to recover his ward and her child, who had allegedly been abducted by hostile Indians and criminal associates. The papers looked authentic enough to give Conrad pause, especially when backed by armed force that suggested official sanction. In the complex legal landscape of territorial justice, competing claims of authority were common. "Let me see those warrants," Conrad said carefully, stepping out of the church, but keeping his deputies in defensive positions. As the two men negotiated over legal technicalities, Nora lay exhausted but alert inside the church, her newborn son sleeping peacefully, despite tension surrounding them. The documents she'd stolen from Kessler's safe were hidden in the church organ where Hattie had secreted them during confusion of the birth. "Those papers prove everything," she whispered to Dr. Emmett, who was checking her condition after the difficult delivery. "His journal especially, it shows he knew all along the baby wasn't his. He was planning to steal Thomas's child and raise him as his own heir. But proving the document's authenticity would take time they might not have, especially if Kessler's forged warrants gave him legal cover to reclaim her before proper investigation could be conducted." The standoff in the churchyard was interrupted by arrival of an unexpected ally. Setan appeared from the tree line with several other Lakota warriors, their faces painted for war and weapons ready for battle. They'd ridden hard through the night after learning of the attack on the mining camp. "Kessler," Setan called out his voice, carrying across snow-covered ground. "You have no authority here. These people are under Lakota protection." It was bold claim that skirted edge of international law. The various Lakota bands maintained treaty relationships with territorial government that granted them limited sovereignty over certain matters, including protection of individuals who sought sanctuary. Kessler's face twisted with rage as he recognized the scout who'd caused him so much trouble. "You have no standing in this matter, Indian. This is white man's law." "The woman asked for our help," Setan replied calmly. "That makes it our concern." The legal situation was rapidly becoming too complex for simple solutions. But while the men argued over jurisdictional authority, events were taking a more direct turn inside the church. Nora had managed to get to her feet despite exhaustion, and she was preparing to make final appeal to anyone who would listen. "All of you hear me." She called out, her voice carrying clearly through the open church door. "I have proof of Leopold Kessler's crimes documents in his own hand describing murder slavery and corruption reaching into territorial government itself." The accusation hung in air like smoke from discharged weapon. If true, it would explain everything. The false warrants, the armed confrontation, the desperate lengths Kessler had gone to reclaim her and the baby. But more than that, she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I have proof that he's been lying about being the father of my child. His own journal admits he's incapable of fathering children and planned to steal my husband's son to use as his heir." The revelation hit like thunderbolt. Even Kessler's own men looked shocked by the accusation, while Conrad's deputies exchanged meaningful glances. "Lies," Kessler said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "The ravings of a hysterical woman trying to avoid her legal obligations." "Then let's examine the evidence," Conrad said firmly. "If Mrs. Hayes has proof of criminal activity, it needs to be evaluated properly." But Kessler had gambled everything on this final attempt to reclaim what he considered his property, and he wasn't prepared to accept defeat gracefully. His hand moved toward his gun, a calculated risk that he could eliminate key witnesses before anyone could stop him. The movement was subtle, but Setan caught it immediately. His own weapon came up in smooth draw that spoke of years of practice covering Kessler before the rancher could clear leather. "Don't," Setan said quietly. "Too many people watching. Too many witnesses." For a moment, the tableau held two armed men facing each other across 20 yards of snow-covered ground, with fate of a woman and child hanging in balance. Then Kessler's shoulders sagged as he realized his years of power and influence had finally come to an end. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice filled with bitter defeat. "Everything I built, everything I worked for, You destroyed it yourself." Nora replied from the church doorway, her baby cradled in her arms. By treating people like property instead of human beings with rights and dignity. The confrontation ended with arrival of U.S. deputy marshals summoned by telegraph from the capital after reports of the mining camp raid reached official channels. They came with genuine warrants and federal authority that superseded all local claims. Leopold Kessler was arrested on charges that would eventually include murder, slavery, fraud, and conspiracy. His criminal empire collapsed within days as investigators followed the paper trail revealed in documents Nora had risked her life to steal. But even as justice was being served, the emotional cost of the ordeal was taking its toll. As Kessler was led away in chains, he looked back once at the woman and child he'd tried to claim as property. What he saw in their faces wasn't fear or hatred, but something far more devastating to a man of his character: pity. The baby stirred in his mother's arms, his brown eyes so clearly, his father's focusing on the world around him with unusual alertness for such a young infant. He was free now, truly free to grow up knowing he was the beloved son of Thomas Hayes, conceived in love and born in liberty. As the sun climbed higher in clear morning sky, melting snow and washing the landscape clean, a new chapter was beginning. The old evils had been defeated, but new challenges lay ahead, and the challenge of raising a child with the best of his heritage, of building a life together in a world that didn't always welcome unconventional families. But they would meet those challenges together, bound by choices made in darkness and desperation, but strengthened by light of justice and redemption. And perhaps in time, something even more precious might grow from the partnership forged in crisis, the kind of love that chose to see possibilities rather than limitations. 3 months after Leopold Kessler's arrest and the dismantling of his criminal empire, the legal proceedings had concluded with convictions that sent shockwaves through the territorial capital. The evidence Nora had stolen proved devastating in court, leading to imprisonment or removal from office of dozens of corrupt officials. Kessler himself died in his jail cell, awaiting trial, found hanging from a noose made of torn bed sheets. Whether suicide or murder by associates who feared what he might reveal, no one could say for certain. But his death marked the end of a reign of terror that had plagued the territory for years. For Nora and Setan, the months following the crisis had been a time of quiet healing and gradual adjustment to their new roles. The cabin on the wooded rise had been transformed from a bachelor's retreat into something approaching a family home, with baby clothes drying on lines and the sound of infant cries replacing solitary silence. Thomas Hayes, as he was known to the legal world, was thriving despite his premature birth. Dr. Emmett pronounced him healthy and strong, with his father's brown eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. He would grow up knowing he was loved and wanted the cherished son of a good man whose memory would guide his upbringing. But it was the gradual deepening of partnership between Setan and Nora that provided the most remarkable development of those peaceful months. What had begun as necessity had evolved into something more complex. Mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the kind of quiet affection that grew from facing hardship together. "I've been thinking about the future," Nora said one evening as they sat on the cabin porch watching Thomas sleep in the carved wooden cradle that Godfrey Walsh had made as a gift. "About what kind of life we want to build here." Setan looked up from the leather he was working, fashioning a new holster to replace one damaged in their adventures. "What kind of future you see?" "A honest one," she replied carefully. "A place where Thomas can grow up safe and loved, where he learns the best of both worlds. Your people's wisdom and the settlers' determination to build something lasting." They'd been dancing around deeper questions for weeks, both understanding that their relationship had evolved beyond simple partnership into something that deserved acknowledgement and commitment. The law might recognize such an arrangement, Sitan said quietly. If we chose to make it formal. It wasn't exactly a proposal, more a careful testing of waters. But Nora understood what he was offering. Not passionate romance, but something perhaps more valuable on the frontier, a partnership based on proven trust and shared values. I think Thomas needs a father who can legally protect him, she said. And I think we've proven we work well together, even under the worst circumstances. The conversation that followed was practical rather than romantic, focused on the realities of building a life together rather than declarations of undying love. But as they discussed the details of legal marriage property rights and child-rearing responsibilities, something deeper emerged: genuine affection between two people who'd seen each other at their worst and found reasons to respect what they'd witnessed. "You're a good man, Seton Running Bear," Nora said finally. "You've proven your honor in ways that matter more than pretty words. I'd be honored to be your wife if you'll have me and Thomas as your family." "I already think of you as family," Seton replied, his weathered hand gentle on the baby's head. The marriage would just make it legal. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning when the aspen leaves had turned gold and the air carried the promise of coming winter. Dr. Emmett performed the ceremony in his capacity as Justice of the Peace, with Sheriff Conrad and Hattie Morrison serving as witnesses. Nora wore her best dress, the blue calico that had survived their adventures carefully cleaned and mended for the occasion. Seton wore his ceremonial shirt with intricate beadwork and the eagle feather that marked his status as a scout and warrior. Thomas slept peacefully through most of the proceedings, wrapped in a soft blanket that bore his initials embroidered in gold thread. The vows were simple and practical. Rather than flowery promises to support each other through hardship, to raise Thomas together with love and wisdom, to face whatever challenges the future might bring as equal partners. When Dr. Emmett pronounced them husband and wife, they sealed their union with a kiss that spoke more of partnership than passion, but was no less meaningful for its restraint. "Mrs. Running Bear?" Seton said quietly, testing the sound of her new name. "Nora Running Bear," she replied, smiling at the way it felt on her tongue. "I like it very much." The small celebration that followed was marked by good food, friendly conversation, and the kind of quiet contentment that came from knowing they'd made the right choice for the right reasons. As guests departed and evening settled over the cabin, the new family settled into routines that were already familiar and comfortable. As they prepared for bed on their wedding night, moving around each other with easy familiarity of people who'd shared danger and responsibility, there was nothing dramatic about their union. No passion-filled embraces or whispered declarations of eternal love. Instead, there was something perhaps more valuable: the quiet certainty of two people who'd chosen each other with clear eyes and honest hearts. "Are you happy?" Seton asked as they settled into bed with Thomas's cradle within easy reach. Nora considered the question seriously before answering. Happiness was a luxury she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. But as she looked around the cabin they'd made into a home, she realized that something very much like it had taken root in her heart. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I truly am." Outside, the October wind rustled through aspen leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Inside the small cabin, a family born of crisis and sustained by choice slept peacefully, bound together by decisions that had transformed strangers into something approaching perfection. Thomas's eyes had closed, hiding whatever dreams came to children too young to remember the violence that had brought them into the world. He would grow up loved and protected, shaped by good examples rather than corrupted by bad ones, free to become whoever he chose to be. The baby's legitimacy, both legal and emotional, had been the final victory in a story full of unexpected blessings. Sometimes the greatest triumph wasn't defeating evil, but transcending it, moving beyond the crimes of the past to create something better for the future. As Satan and Nora drifted off to sleep, they carried with them the satisfaction of people who'd fought for what mattered and won. Not through vengeance or violence, but through courage, determination, and the kind of love that chose to see possibilities rather than limitations. In the months and years that followed, their unlikely family would face the normal challenges of frontier life: drought and harsh winters, economic hardship, and social prejudice. The difficulties of raising a mixed heritage child in a world that often showed little tolerance for those who didn't fit neat categories. But they would meet those challenges together, united by bonds forged in crisis and strengthened by daily choice. Thomas would grow up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in Lakota councils and settler communities, carrying the best of both worlds forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. The Running Bear family had found something rare and precious: a place where the past could not reach them, where the future held only promise, and where the present was exactly as it should be. In a world that often seemed hostile to happiness, they had created their own sanctuary, where love could grow without fear or reservation. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything that mattered in the world.